10 years before Harold Sutton knocked on his daughter's door in Atlanta, he had been the one to close it. And 10 years before she opened it, Claire Sutton Washington had made a habit, every Friday evening, without planning it, almost without knowing she was doing it, of leaving the porch light on. Not for any particular reason, not for Harold. She had told herself it was just a habit, a safety thing, the kind of thing you do when you live alone and then keep doing when you don't. But her husband Marcus had noticed, in the first year of their marriage, that the porch light was always on Fridays, and he had never asked why. Because Marcus Washington understood which silences belonged to his wife and which ones she would tell him about when she was ready. When she told him, on a Tuesday evening 6 years into the marriage while she was washing dishes and he was drying them, he put down the towel and said, "Then we keep the light on." They had kept it on every Friday since. The Friday Harold Sutton knocked on the door, 8 years into the marriage and 2 years into the grandchild he did not know he had, it was on. When Steve Harvey heard this on the Family Feud stage in Atlanta, the porch light, the 10 years, the Tuesday dish conversation, the granddaughter, he sat down on the floor of his own stage for the second time in the show's 45-year history. And what Harold Sutton said from the family section, in a voice that shook, into a microphone Steve brought to him, would be seen by 308 million people and be described by a family therapist writing in The Atlantic as the most publicly documented moment of earned reconciliation in recent memory. 10 years earlier, in a living room in Marietta, Georgia, Harold Sutton, 58 at the time, a retired county administrator who had spent 31 years doing things by the rule, had looked at his 23-year-old daughter Claire and told her that if she continued her relationship with Marcus Washington, she would have to leave his house. Claire had looked at her father for a long moment. She had said, "Then I'll leave." She had gone upstairs, packed 2 bags, and come back down, and Harold had stood in the doorway of the living room and watched her go, and had said nothing. He had not called after her. He had not followed her. He had told his wife Diane that Claire needed time to think. Diane had looked at him. She had said nothing. She had gone to the kitchen. She had called Claire's cell phone the moment she was out of Harold's sight. It was a Saturday afternoon in October, 10 years and 2 months after the door closed, when the Washington Sutton family walked onto the Family Feud stage in Atlanta. Marcus and Claire were at the podium. Marcus, 38. A structural engineer with the steady, unhurried manner of a man who has been the anchor of his family through things that required anchoring. Claire, 33, with her mother's green eyes and the particular composure of a woman who has been through a fire that lasted a decade and come out knowing exactly who she is. In the family section, their daughter Maya, 2 years old, who had no interest in sitting still and every interest in the lights. Claire's mother Diane, 66, who had spent 10 years walking the tightrope between her husband and her daughter and had worn thin from it. And Harold Sutton, 68, who had driven from Marietta 3 hours early and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes before coming inside, and who was now sitting in the family section with his hands on his knees, looking at the stage where his daughter was standing, in the careful way a man looks at something he knows he almost lost permanently. Steve did his warm-up pass and stopped at Harold. He said, "Sir." "What's your name?" Harold said, "Harold." Steve said, "Harold." "You drove a long way." Harold said, "Longer than the miles." Steve looked at him for a moment. He said, "I'll come back to that." He moved on. He filed it. He kept moving. Every evening for 6 months after she left her father's house, Claire ate dinner alone in a studio apartment in Decatur and left a lamp on by the window. Not a porch light. She didn't have a porch. But the lamp by the window served the same purpose, and she knew it, even if she didn't say so. She had told herself it was for safety. She had told herself many things in those 6 months. She had also cried in the shower approximately 4 mornings a week, because the shower was the one place she had decided she was allowed to, and she had kept to that agreement with herself with the discipline of a woman who had decided that her grief was going to have walls around it, so it didn't eat her workday. Marcus had been with her from the beginning, not in her apartment, they were not yet living together, but present in the daily sense of presence. Morning texts, evening calls, weekends spent building something normal and good inside the wreckage of what Harold had done. He had never asked Claire to reconcile with her father. He had never said anything against Harold. He had said once, about 3 months after the door closed, "When you're ready to talk about him, I'm ready to listen." She had said, "I'm not ready." He had said, "Okay." He had not brought it up again until she did. She brought it up 18 months later. She said, "I think about my dad every Friday." Marcus said, "Why Fridays?" She thought about it. She said, "My parents had a standing Friday dinner when I was a kid. It was the family night. It was his idea." Marcus said, "Tell me about the Friday dinners." She did. She talked for 40 minutes. He listened for all 40. When she was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Okay." She said, "Can we leave the porch light on Fridays?" He said, "We don't have a porch." She said, "We will someday." He said, "Then yes." She said, "Until then, can we just," he said, "leave a light on?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "Yes." Diane had been the bridge throughout. She had called Claire every Sunday from the day she left, from the kitchen, in the window of time Harold spent in the garage on Sunday mornings. She had told Claire about Harold in the careful, loving way of a wife who cannot excuse what her husband did, but also cannot stop being his wife. Small things. The information she felt Claire needed to have. She told Claire when Harold stopped eating dinner at the table. She told Claire when he started going to the Friday dinner spot alone. She told Claire, 2 years in, that Harold had asked about Marcus. Not asked about reconciling, just asked, "What does he do?" Diane had told him. Harold had said good. That was all. Diane told Claire. Claire had said, "Okay." She had gone to the window and adjusted the lamp. Maya was born in August, 8 years after the door closed. Claire had called Diane from the hospital. Diane had come the following morning. She had held Maya for 3 hours. She had cried. When she left, she had said, "Your father doesn't know." Claire had said, "I know." Diane had said, "Do you want him to?" Claire had said, "I don't know yet." Diane had said, "Okay." She had driven home. She had not told Harold. She had sat in their kitchen that evening and looked at the kitchen table and made a decision. She had called Claire back. She had said, "Claire, I love your father, but I am not going to carry this secret for the rest of my life. I'm going to tell him about Maya. Not today, but soon, and I need you to know that." Claire had said, "Tell him." Diane had said, "Are you sure?" Claire had said, "Yes, because either it changes something or it doesn't, and I'd rather know." Harold had come to the door on a Friday evening, 2 months after Diane told him about Maya. He had called first, one call, to Claire's number, which she had changed twice since leaving but had given to Diane when the first grandbaby picture was sent. He had said, "Claire, it's your father. Can I come?" She had held the phone for a moment. She had looked at Marcus. He had nodded. Once she had said, "The light is on." Harold had said, "I'll be there at 6." She had said, "Okay." She had ended the call. She had sat down in the kitchen, and Marcus had sat across from her, and they had looked at each other for a while without saying anything. He had arrived at 5:57. He had knocked. Claire had opened the door. Harold had looked at his daughter for the first time in 10 years, and he had looked at the light on above the door, and he had said, "You left the light on." She had said, "Every Friday." He had said, "I didn't know." She had said, "I know." He had said, "Can I come in?" She had said, "Come in." The door's open. He had stepped across the threshold. Marcus had been in the kitchen. Harold had looked at him. Marcus had looked at Harold. Harold had said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology." Marcus had said, "You owe Claire more." Harold had looked at his daughter. He had said, "Yes, I do." He had said it to her directly, for the first time, "I'm sorry, Claire, I was wrong." And "I'm sorry." Claire had said, "I know." She had said, "Come meet Maya." They had applied to Family Feud 4 months later because Diane had seen an episode and said, "Harold, you should go on this show." Harold had looked at her. He had said, "They wouldn't want me." Diane had said, "Let Claire decide." Claire had said, "Yes." She had said, "But Harold's coming." Marcus had said, "Of course, Harold's coming." Steve Harvey would later say that Harold Sutton's Friday drive from Marietta was the definition of a man arriving at himself. The fast money round was done, 191 points, when Steve looked at Harold in the family section and said, "Harold, you said longer than the miles. Tell me what you meant." Harold looked at Claire. Claire nodded. Harold told the story. He told it the way men tell things they are ashamed of, in the specific, unvarnished way of someone who has decided that precision is the only form of penance that means anything. He told it from the living room to the parking lot of this studio. He said, "I sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes today because I didn't know if I deserved to be in the same building as my daughter." He paused. He said, "She left the light on. 10 years. Every Friday." He stopped. 300 people did not move. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing. Steve Harvey pressed his handkerchief to his face. He walked to the edge of the stage. He picked up a handheld microphone from a stage assistant. He walked into the audience. He held the microphone in front of Harold. He said, "Say something to her." Harold looked at Claire at the podium. He said, "I thought I was protecting something worth protecting. I was wrong. What I was protecting wasn't worth one Friday of that light being on." He stopped. "I love you, Claire. I love Marcus. I love Maya. And I know I don't get the 10 years back. But I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up." He stopped. He said, "I should have shown up sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Steve stood beside Harold for a moment. He said, "I know what it is when someone won't let you in the door. When I was sleeping in my car, I knocked on doors. Metaphorically, most of them didn't open, and the ones that did, I never forgot." Harold Sutton knocked on his daughter's door, and she opened it, and she said, "Come in, the door's open, that is the whole thing, that is everything." He said, to the room, to the cameras, to everyone watching at home, "Come in. The door's open." He sat down, on the floor of the Family Feud stage, for the second time in the show's history. He sat there for a moment, with the microphone in his hand. He said, "I had to sit down. I'm sorry." Nobody laughed, nobody applauded. The room just held it. He wasn't done. He stood up. He pulled out his phone and called his personal physician, asking that Harold Sutton be connected with a comprehensive health and wellness program through the Harvey Foundation, because a man who drove here to do the right thing deserves to be around for a long time to keep doing it. He announced both families, the Washington Suttons and the competing family, the Greens from Savannah, were leaving with the full $20,000. The Green family crossed the stage. Their grandfather, 74, shook Harold's hand and said, "It takes what it takes, brother. You got here." Harold said, "Later than I should have." The man said, "But you got here." The episode aired 9 weeks later, 308 million views. The hashtag "The Light Was On" trended for 11 days in 23 countries. Family therapists across the country reported a surge in voluntary appointments from fathers estranged from adult children, many citing the episode specifically. One therapist wrote in a widely shared post, "Harold Sutton walked into a family therapy office in my building the week the episode aired. He said, 'I need help being the version of myself who deserves to stay.'" 3 months after the taping, Claire and Marcus bought a house with a porch. The porch had a light. On the first Friday in the new house, Harold drove from Marietta and sat on the porch with Claire and Maya while Marcus grilled and Diane set the table inside. Harold held Maya. He had learned to hold her in the months since the door. He had learned the way you learn things you should have known earlier, with a particular concentration of someone who understands they are on borrowed time and intends to make use of every minute of it. Maya, who had recently developed opinions about everything, told her grandfather that his hat was wrong. He took the hat off. She approved of his hair. He laughed. It was the first time Claire had heard her father laugh in 10 years. A year after the taping, the porch light was on every Friday, without exception. Harold came to dinner 3 out of 4 Fridays per month. He had become, in those months, someone his daughter recognized from before the door. The man who had invented Friday dinners, who had known that the family night was worth protecting, who had just protected the wrong thing for too long. He was relearning the right things. He was trying. Maya helped. Maya, at 3, had no interest in the past, and an enormous interest in her grandfather's hat collection, which had expanded since she had taken charge of its curation. Today, the 10-Year Door Foundation, named for the decade between the closing and the opening, provides family mediation, reconciliation counseling, and long-term estrangement support for families separated by interracial relationship rejection. Its motto, taken from what Claire said when Harold asked if he could come in, is, "Come in." The door's open. The foundation has served 2,100 families across the country and maintains a 24-hour reconciliation support line staffed by trained therapists in 12 cities. Steve spoke about Harold in an interview the following spring. He said, "He sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes. He said he didn't know if he deserved to be in the same building as his daughter." That's not a villain's line. That's a man who finally understood what he did. And his daughter left the light on for 10 years. She didn't know if he was ever going to knock. She left it on anyway. That's the story. The light and the knock and the door. That's everything. 2 years after the taping, Maya turned 4. Harold brought her a hat, a small one, his size, made small. She put it on. She looked in the mirror. She said, "Grandpa, we match." Harold said, "We do." He looked at Claire across the room. She looked at him. The porch light was on. It was a Friday. If Harold's 45 minutes in the parking lot and Claire's 10 years of Friday light moved you, subscribe and share with someone who believes it is never too late to find your family or your way home. Have you ever left a light on for someone who wasn't sure they deserved to knock? Or been the one who finally knocked? Share your story in the comments. Because, as Claire Sutton Washington proved, love does not have an expiration date. And the door is always worth leaving open.